Punishments carried out during the medieval era tend to be amongst the most infamous and cruel throughout history. The choke Pear, Iron Maiden, and Thumbscrews were awful enough to give me nightmares, and we have even more than that to discuss, so let's get into it. We might as well start off with the most infamous device of them all, and that's the rack. This was the device used at the Tower of London, a royal palace that also served as a prison. The device consisted of this crazy rectangular, usually wooden frame, raised slightly up from the ground with a roller at one or both ends, having at one end a fixed bar to which the legs would be fastened, and at the other a movable bar to which the hands would be fastened. The victim's feet would be tied to one roller, the wrist chained to another. You get the idea. Starting in the 15th century, the warders who worked at the tower used the rack to pull on ropes tied to a victim's wrist and ankles. What would this do? Well, it stretched the body, dislocated your joints, and sometimes did more than that. Folks used the rack on people suspected of treason and religious crimes to try and get them to confess and give up the names of other conspirators. One famous victim was the English writer and Protestant preacher Anne Askew. In 1546, she was sentenced to the rack, and her punishers asked her to name Protestant sympathizers, which is a nice way of saying they demanded those names. After she refused, they burned her at the stake. Because the punishment actually made her unable to walk, they had to carry her to her death. In fact, the rack was first used in antiquity, and it is unclear exactly from which civilization it originated, though some of the earliest examples are actually from Greece. Arian, Anabasis of Alexander, states that Alexander the Great had the pages who conspired in his assassination and their mentor, his court historian, tormented on the rack in 328 BC. The Judas Cradle, a macabre invention, involved lowering victims onto a sharp, pyramid-shaped seat. This device gets its name from the biblical figure who betrayed Jesus Christ. It was believed that the damn thing was named after Judas as a means of punishing those who were deemed to have betrayed their fellow man. So, while suspended above the ground, the victim's weight would gradually force the point into the body. Yep, into, causing unbearable pain. Sometimes you'd add a weight to the victim's legs, which, that would increase the pain and also result in a quicker death. Other times you'd add oil to the device, which, makes it worse. Various innovations were used to make a lot of pain from this a lot more painful. To begin with, the device was never washed, which made it all the more dangerous and infectious. So hey, if you do survive by some miracle, deadly infections, time for those. Among other methods, the victim was repeatedly pushed down on said pyramid to increase pain. Sometimes you'd raise them with ropes and give them momentary, relief, but that's not mercy. That's just prolonging the pain and the misery. This device symbolized both physical and psychological torment as the body succumbed to relentless agony. Now, this cradle, with its grotesque symbolism, encapsulated the medieval mindset that sought not just physical punishment, but a twisted form of poetic justice against perceived wrongdoers. During the 16th and 17th centuries, tormentors at the Tower of London also used the Scavenger's daughter as a punishment device. This was a metal frame that compressed the victim's body in on itself. Compression from this form of punishment was so intense that it could actually cause a victim to start exuding redness from the nose, mouth, and other extremities of the body. This gruesome form of awfulness could absolutely result in death. How'd you know? Well, it might not have been as widely used as some other heinous devices we will talk about today and have talked about. Historical records, including illustrations, writings, and accounts from the time period, provide evidence of its existence and use. One notable historical figure who might have encountered this was Edward Arden. He was an English nobleman and a distant relative of Queen Elizabeth I, who became embroiled in a plot to overthrow the Queen and replace her with Mary, Queen of Scots. So in 1583, Arden was arrested and accused of treason for his involvement in the plot. During his interrogation and trial, Arden was likely subjected to various forms of punishment, including the use of devices such as the Scavenger's daughter to extract a confession and gather information about the conspiracy. While the specific details of this torment are not well documented, it's known he was ultimately found guilty of treason and went the way of the rope necklace in December of 1583. The Pear of Anguish is a device that early modern Europeans labeled as a medieval torment device, and rightfully so. Supposedly, somebody who would cause torment would insert this device into a person's mouth, but it could also be used in your hoo-ha or rear end in order to widen the orifice, causing extreme pain. There's a number of examples of ornate and elaborate pear-shaped devices with 3 or 4 leaves or lobes, driven by turning a key that rotates the central screw thread, which spreads the leaves held in museums devoted to the subject of punishment. And some of the ones in museums, but not all, have spikes of uncertain purpose at the bottom of each leaf for extra fun or pain. A cheap and popular way to end somebody, or punish them, was by forcing a rat through a victim's body as a way to escape a cage they had been put in. And by that I mean the rat was caged, not the human. So if you were a human being sentenced to this, you'd be strapped down to the point where you can't move, can't escape, and then somebody would cut some little slits into your body. And then here come the rats. Hungry rats would be placed in the slits to eat the victim from the inside. Gnawing the intestines usually took hours or days of agonizing pain for the victim, and unless stopped almost immediately, this form of punishment usually resulted in death. While the Iron Maiden has a lot of what ifs, as in did it exist, the Chair of Torment, which is similar, has been proven to have existed way back when. Now there's a lot of variants of the chair, but they all have one thing in common. Spikes cover the back, the armrests, the seat, the leg rests, and footrests. The number of spikes on one of these chairs ranges anywhere from 500 to 1500 spikes. To avoid movement, the victim's wrists would be tied to the chair, or in one version, 2 bars push the arms against armrests for the spikes to penetrate the flesh even further. In some versions, there were holes under the chair's rear end where the tormentor would place coal to cause severe burns while the victim still remained conscious. In other versions, there were weights that would be placed on the victim's thighs or feet, and in a very special version, there were spikes on the headrest. And yes, the victim's head would be shoved against it. That's kind of the end. This instrument's strength lies primarily in the psychological fear caused to victims. Folks would often use the victim's fear to coerce them into confessing by forcing them to watch somebody else be punished with this instrument. Now, the time of death greatly varied. We're talking a couple of hours, a day, more, and none of these spikes were meant to penetrate any vital organs. And the wounds were closed by the spikes themselves, which delayed fluid loss greatly, only prolonging pain. While death by exposure might sound kind of tame compared to the other punishments on today's list, you might not be thinking so in a moment. So let's start with freezing to death. A nude victim would be forced to stand outside in full view of everybody. Slowly, the punishment inflictor would pour water on the victim's head, and then that would freeze, making them die very slowly, very painfully. Sometimes the body would be left out for the whole winter to terrify the population and then dissuade any further crimes. But then, if it's not winter and it's summer, you've got live burial. As its name implies, this method consists of exposing a victim to the elements. So you could be buried up to your neck, letting any animals, insects, or anything else kill them slowly. And then, finally, being restrained, which is a large iron basket with holes large enough for arms and legs, would be hung from a pole with somebody inside of it. During hot days, the metal would heat, causing pain. During cold days and nights, the chill, as well as lack of protection from the wind, could sap a victim's body heat. The holes in the grating were also big enough to allow any kind of critters, such as birds, rats, to enter and pluck at your victim. Next up, the concept of a ducking chair. Not to be confused with a cucking chair, or the red hot stools that if you were a gal and you were accused of having fun acts with the devil, you'd have to sit on that. Whole other thing. So this stool was a strongly made wooden armchair, often made out of oak, in which an offender would be seated with an iron band being placed around them so they're not going to fall off their chair. The earliest use of this is around the beginning of the 17th century, with the term first being attested in English in 1597, and this was used in Europe, North America, all over. Usually this chair would be fastened to a long wooden beam, kind of like a seesaw, on the edge of a pond or a river. Sometimes it wasn't like a fixture, but it'd be mounted on a pair of wooden wheels so that it could be wheeled through the streets. And at the river edge, it would be hung by like a chain from the end of a beam. During the sentencing, magistrates would order the number of duckings a woman should have. And there's no particular data on like the range of numbers. Unless you know something, then let us know in the comments. Another type of ducking stool was called a tumbrel, which was a chair on 2 wheels with 2 long shafts fixed to the axles. So that would be pushed into a pond and then the shafts would be released, ergo tipping the chair up backwards. Sometimes this proved fatal and the subject died. Once again, that should be taken with a pound of salt. In medieval times until the early 18th century, this was a way to establish whether a suspect was a witch or not. The stools were first used for that purpose, but then it was later inflicted without a chair. So then you'd bind somebody's thumb to your toe, and you'd tie a rope around the waist of the accused and just throw them into the river or a deep pond. Now, if your victim floats, she's in league with the devil. Game over. And if she sinks, she's cleared. Oh, and she's dead. In England, Statute 22, passed in 1532 by King Henry VIII, made boiling a legal form of capital punishment. It began to be used for folks who killed people, usually using poison, after the Bishop of Rochester's cook, Richard Rice, gave a number of people poisoned porridge, resulting in 2 deaths in February of 1532. Boiling to death was employed once again in 1542 for a woman who also used poison. It was also used for counterfeiters, swindlers, and coin forgers during the Middle Ages. So how would you do it? Well, you'd get a large cauldron filled with water, oil, tar, tallow, or molten lead, and then you'd obviously boil it. Now sometimes you'd chuck your victim in the cauldron before it was boiled so they could be cooked slowly, or if it was already boiling, then you'd toss them in head first. This was more frequently used as a way to end the life of a prisoner, but it was also used to extract confessions. And finally for today, tormentors used the thumbscrew, which is another pain-inflicting device from Europe's early modern period to crush a person's fingers or thumbs. Similarly to the rack, folks employed the thumbscrew as a means of punishment and to elicit a confession. It was also known as like a thumbicon, with a lot of spelling variations. Well, that's it for me once again, folks. I've been Alexa, your resident emo girly. See y'all next time I buzz in over here at Bumblebee.